Hey y'all. Last week, Democrats won big in key races across the country. It was a huge night. Prop 50 passed in California, we won big in Virginia, and states like Mississippi and Georgia even saw Democrats make historic gains. It was a sharp contrast from how we all felt on election night in 2024 and how we felt since Trump took office again, period. And despite that excitement, the fight for our democracy is far from over. Republicans are still trying to pass extreme gerrymanders across the country as we speak. Luckily, in the midst of all of this chaos, we have the champion, Marc Elias, fighting across the country for all of your rights. And we are very, very grateful to have him as a close partner in our work. Marc is the founder of Democracy Docket and one of our country's leading voices when it comes to protecting voting rights and our democracy. You might also know him as the attorney who led the legal response for President Biden's 2020 campaign when Trump tried to dispute the results of the election. We are so thrilled, Marc, to have you on the show with us today. Let's jump right in. So we're coming off a great win on election night. Do you think that these results could signal that Trump's gerrymandering strategy could backfire?
Look, I think it complicates things for him because, whenever you are redrawing maps the way he is, which is to maximize Republican seats everywhere he can, you have to make certain assumptions about what the turnout will be in elections and who those people that turn out will vote for. And what we saw in the 2025, I guess, off-year elections, we'll call them, was just an absolute, complete transformation of the electorate, in that you saw Democrats win not just large margins in New Jersey and Virginia, but you saw them win, for example, two statewide elections in Georgia. The first time that non-federal elections had gone for a Democrat in Georgia, I think in 20 years. You saw them flip a number of very red districts in Virginia in the state house. You saw them flip seats in Mississippi. And I think that has to inevitably affect the psychology of the Republican members, if no one else, as these maps are being redrawn.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the fact, especially we're talking about places like Indiana and Kansas and Nebraska that have been rumored to redraw over the past few months, really, and sustaining a great deal of pressure from the Trump administration. But these folks just saw a complete wipeout. And a lot of them, I think this gets lost sometimes, in order to redraw these maps, they got to take their members down to a place that maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago they would have thought was comfortable. But I'd be pretty nervous if I were a lot of these members and trying to look at a map that had me coming down to a place that now I'm going to be vulnerable. We may end up losing more seats than we thought. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And remember, for every member of Congress, before they worry about how good it will be to be in the majority, they focus on how good it is for them to be in Congress. So, for these Republican members, the first, second, and third thing they do when they look at a new map is they look at their own situation. And for them, they're not going to be willing to give up Republican voters in order to maybe gain a seat someplace else that isn't them, right? So I think that is likely going to intrude here into their thinking. Now, whether it makes a difference is another thing, right? I mean, one of the things we learned in Texas was that Adam Kincaid, your close friend, from the National Republican Redistricting operation, he drew the map in Texas. And as far as the testimony seemed to indicate, the people in Texas had nothing to do with it. Like, it literally just was handed on from down high. So, the question will always be like, how much do these rank and file members even matter to the calculation that are being made?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And they especially in Texas, it seems that they don't care. The alternative or parallel to what I was describing in the States is that the Trump administration has to be even more concerned and more scared that they're going to lose seats in the House and probably going to ramp up pressure to try and gerrymander even more. But I think a lot of folks see this as very binary. They say, like, okay, well, Trump's just going to get more seats out of the states. And they don't fully conceptualize that, like, sometimes those seats don't exist. You're going to have to go and draw if you're going to try and steal 2 seats out of a place like Indiana, you may well end up losing.
That's exactly right. And Indiana is a good example of that. Like, I'm not sure that there are 2 seats for them to have. And I think, by the way, you look at the compromise that was rendered in Ohio. I think that part of that was sort of pragmatism on both sides. But part of it was also, like, I think Republicans in Ohio realized they faced a possibility of overreaching and having, winding up in the worst of all possible worlds.
Yeah, I mean those seats are going to be competitive, no matter what.
Oh.
And I think it'll be really interesting to see what that sort of does in moving forward in terms of setting precedent for Republicans looking at their maps. The other big thing that happened, I know we had these great election results, but specifically in Virginia, the election results came on the heels of the Virginia legislature voting for the first round to move forward a constitutional amendment that would allow Virginia to redraw its map, that will allow Democrats in Virginia to respond to this current crisis. And there was some anxiety ahead of time that, they were going to be doing this ahead of an election. And then you saw, just historic turnout, historic results for Democrats in Virginia. What do we think, what does that say about the path forward for us, for Democrats to keep pushing and to make sure that we are fighting with everything that we've got to make sure we're protecting our democracy in the coming midterms?
Yeah, look, I've written about this. I think that you have to look at Virginia, exactly what you said, as perhaps the most consequential part of the election results, because, and I live in Virginia, so I followed it closely. Yes, it is incredibly important that that the governorship in both New Jersey and Virginia were won, and that in the end, actually, it wasn't close in either state. It was, not a surprise. Maybe the margin was a surprise of how big the victory was in California for the ballot measure. But what happened in Virginia is momentum had stalled for Democrats. Like it was, if you go back 2 weeks before the election, the sense was that, yeah, Spamberger is going to win because she's facing a very unpopular opponent and a very unpopular president, and she's a very good candidate. Okay, that was kind of like baked in the cake. But there was a sense that, for example, the AG candidate for the Democratic AG candidate was going to lose because of a scandal that had enveloped him about texts he had sent. And the sense was that there was a possibility that there'd be a dampened down ballot effect from Spamberger. And what the House, particularly the state House Democrats in Virginia, did is they said, we're going to make this a referendum on redistricting. We're going to do it by proposing that we are going to do this mechanism, this procedure to redraw the maps. And that very squarely put on the ballot the question of mid-cycle redistricting in Virginia, because after all, Republicans, if they had gained seats, if they had won a majority, they could have stopped it. And for Democrats to do it, they had to hold the majority or expand it. And what you saw was a historic turnout. You saw a historic, you saw Democrats gain 13 or 14 seats. I think it's 13 now. Maybe it'll eventually be 14. But to give Democrats the largest majority they have had in decades in the state House. And so I don't think there's any way to read those Virginia results, certainly when you tie them and you look at for example, the California results, but there's no way to read that other than as grassroots voter support for fighting Republican gerrymandering with every tool available.
Yeah, well, let's talk about California for a minute, right? We have a state where, I don't know, 4 months ago, no one in the state knew there was going to be an election. And you had 8+ million people show up at the polls and have a massive rebuke of Trump's, authoritarian redistricting takeover starting in Texas. So I don't know. Yeah, give us your thoughts on California and what that means for other states across the country.
Yeah, look, I think that if you look at California, and I'm going to tie it to another state that was not about redistricting, but you also look at the main ballot initiative on voter ID. So the conventional wisdom, 4 months ago, to pick that date, the day before Gavin Newsom announced anything, the conventional wisdom was in California, nonpartisan redistricting was overwhelmingly popular, and there would be no way to undo it. And the Republicans have been selling us that voter ID is unbelievably popular and that it would win in a ballot initiative. And here we are, having had both of those issues fully litigated in the public consciousness, not just a poll question on a phone. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? But really litigated. And what I mean by that is that there was a lot of money spent on both sides of the redistricting thing. It's not just like Gavin Newsom raised a lot of money. The other side's had a fair number of billionaires spending money on the other side. And what you wound up with in both states was that conventional wisdom flipping on its head. And in California, you saw that this ballot initiative passed not just by, a narrow margin, but really by an overwhelming margin. And I think what it goes to show is that, that people want their leaders to fight for their democracy. They want people to protect democracy, and they are willing to set aside some long-standing policy preferences that they may have in order to achieve those victories against authoritarianism. And so, I think that if I were a Democratic governor or state legislator in another state, I'd be looking at this and saying, this is a place where good policy and good politics merge.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think, can we switch gears for a second? I want to get your take. One of the questions we all, I'm sure, but I specifically get all the time is just tally up the number. Give me the number. What's the number? Redistricting's happening all over the country. I didn't cause this. I don't like it, but I don't care. Just tell me what the number is. Republicans do their worst. Dems do their worst. It's like what? And one of the reasons I always cite for not being able to answer that adequately is the litigation and trying to roll back some of these Republican gerrymanders, and for the reality that they're illegal or unconstitutional, depending on state or federal grounds. So I would just love your take generally on the path of litigation and this redistricting strategy, because I think it's getting dramatically undertold.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think that there's a weird split screen going on, which is, on the one hand, people act as if when legislatures do these things, the lawsuits that follows are kind of not worth covering. I mean, I was struck the Texas redistricting hearing, which went on for 10 days, for all of the national media covering the walkout of the Democratic legislators, which was important. There was almost no coverage of the legal effort to undo, what was essentially a racial gerrymander. And I think that we are finding that, across the country, because there are good legal challenges to what it is that Republicans are doing. And, I'm not saying that we will win all of those cases, but odds are we'll win some of them. And it may very well change the complexion of what things look like, if depending on where the wins are and when the wins are, because that tends to have an effect, and you guys know this, that tends to have an effect beyond just the borders of the one state. It sets a tone, it creates permission structures that are sort of not obvious beforehand. Litigation is the variable that can oftentimes spur public outrage, public concern. And so, I think that everyone needs to be paying attention to these cases, and not just the big case in the Supreme Court, which of course everyone I think is paying attention to, which is the Voting Rights Act case out of Louisiana, but also what's happening in Missouri, what's happening in North Carolina, what's happening in Texas, what's happening in Utah, what will be happening if they do what they're apparently planning to do in Florida. Right? And these cases, I think there are. I mean, you tell me if I got this right. I think there are now, if you include the Georgias, the Alabamas, and Louisianas, I think there are like 11 states right now that have their maps under one form or review or another.
Yeah. Well, and just to put a finer point and to loop back what you're saying to a point you made earlier, which is that the I think Democracy Docket was doing the day-to-day readouts, for the public for the Texas preliminary injunction hearing, which was incredibly useful. And, the point that you're saying about the information coming out, right? And there's a lot of coverage about when the map, you said there's a lot of coverage about the Texas walkout. There's a lot of coverage about the map and when it's passed. But then you get into litigation and you get, as you mentioned, like Adam Kincaid on the stand in El Paso explaining what happened. And on the front end, when we see these maps, there's sometimes good hard information, but a lot of times it's like reporting from, such and such sources that like, this is what the White House is saying, or this is what, we think happened. And then when you're in the litigation, you actually get the full story and the full information of exactly what happened. And to your point, like being able to, I think, especially now, it's really like our media landscape is, so complicated, but in these this is like a person under oath saying what exactly happened, and it's not the guessing game, and it's not the people surmising what might have happened, or you're putting pieces of information together about what the White House's plan is or what their strategy is, and so I think I just wanted to sort of pull those pieces together that you'd mentioned, because you'd mentioned the the testimony that was given, which is that this is a map that was drawn for the White House. It was not drawn for, Texas legislators. It was not drawn for the Texas Republican delegation. It was drawn for the White House and then sort of handed down on high. And I think as we see the fight moving from state to state, for example, in Missouri, they saw what happened in Texas, and there was this push by Governor Kehoe to say like, oh, well, this is a Missouri first map. This is all about, Missouri. And it's just like complete BS. And being able to show that it's complete BS instead of just having that be like an argument or a talking point is so incredibly useful and helpful in the grand scheme of, showing to the American public what is really happening. And it not sort of boiling down to like, oh, this is just like a part of this just gets sort of like lost in the partisan tit for tat.
Yeah, no, I think that, like I said, litigation can be catalyzing in many respects. Number one, it can obviously change the facts on the ground because you can win cases. The second is when you win cases or even parts of cases, like I said, it can change the psychology around issues. But regardless of win or lose, litigation is oftentimes serves a very important truth-telling function. I mean, if I'm living in Texas right now, let me tell you what I now know that I didn't know before there was litigation. I now know that the map was drawn by a Washington, D.C. operative who took his direction not from anyone in the state of Texas, but rather from the White House and the RNC. And in fact, I believe he testified that when there were public hearings in Texas, he paid literally no attention to them. So for those citizens who waited, in line to testify about the map, it was all theater because the person drawing the map didn't mind it one bit. And I think that actually is an important part of the equation if I'm a voter in Texas. And I'd say the same thing, by the way, about what's gone on in Utah. I mean, if I live in Salt Lake City, I mean, the Utah Republicans are going to an awful lot of trouble to prevent people from Salt Lake City from being able to have, elect candidates of their choice. And if I were living in Salt Lake City, whether I was a Democrat or Republican, I think I'd be pretty upset about that. And I don't think you'd know about it the way you do, but for the litigation that's gone on.
Well, Utah, we are, speaking of the Utah litigation, that has been, Utah is kind of an interesting state. I think Utah and Ohio had, sort of their own stories this year, and were the only states that we expected to move and potentially have redistricting.
Right, exactly. At the beginning of the year, we thought there'd be two states that were
right. And here we are. But so in Utah, we are still, the litigation is also still over the 2021 map. And as you said, in 11 states, like we still have, our affiliate, the National Redistricting Foundation, working with Elias Law Group, still has cases in, a handful of states over maps that were drawn in 2021 and 2022. Like that's the VRA case that's at the Supreme Court is over a map that was, initially drawn in 2022. Right. So like the sort of sequence of events here is that the litigation is still ongoing in a number of these places and still incredibly important because, for example, in Utah, like it's in state court, but it's already gone up to the Utah Supreme Court and back down again. We are now, hopefully by the time of publishing, have a decision from the Utah Supreme Court. At time of recording, we don't know what that's going to be, but but I think you're right, and it shows like how hard you have to fight for this, and I think to the point, just like tying the litigation piece together with what people want to see, which is that they want to see a fight, and they want to see a fight for our democracy. I mean, I think everything feels so existential all the time, but the reality is that it like takes, waking up every day and pushing, all the levers that we can push and just continuing to move forward. And so, both of those things have to happen, which is the galvanizing of voters and showing that like there is a fight and it's a worthwhile one. And part of that fight is in courts.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And you know, I think this is part of a broader understanding that the American people have come to, that so many of our institutions have failed us. I mean, you know, I could go on endlessly about how the large law firms have failed us. I know you guys agree with me on that. Uh, I could talk about how the legacy media has failed this moment in history. We could talk about the universities. We could talk about other institutions and individuals who we thought would stand up. And it turns out that actually the courts are being the most stalwart. Now, that isn't to say that they're perfect. If people don't know, you know, John and Marina and I, we agonize every case. Like we agonize every trial court case. We agonize every decision in every trial court case because we're committed to trying to make sure that our democracy survives. And the fact is that more often than not, we are finding again in the broader society that the courts are the most imperfect but most effective protector of those rights. And I think that's going to be true in redistricting also. I mean, I think that, you know, at the end of the day, there's going to be, you know, it's not going to take away the hurt and the harm. And we will feel that in our bones when there is hurt and there is harm. But there will also be moments of joy and success, and you know, people can't ignore those either. I mean, I'm mindful of the fact that, you know, we were told, the three of us were told, that if North Carolina brought their case to the U.S. Supreme Court in the independent legislature theory case, that would be the end of state courts applying their state constitutions. And instead, we won. And then we were told that if the Supreme Court took the case out of Alabama involving the Voting Rights Act, it would be the end of the Voting Rights Act. And instead, we won. And the result was, because of the work that you guys do and we do along with you, the result is that the Black voters of Alabama had a fair map for the first time in decades. I mean, you know, their federal voting rights acts had been their federal voting rights had been violated, and for at least one election they weren't. And in North Carolina, they had fair elections for a cycle. Now, people will say, yeah, but then it gets reversed. And what I tell them is, if you can't celebrate the victories you have, then you're in the wrong line of work. But I do think the courts are going to provide those victories along the way.
Yeah, look, and I mean, Mark, you've been such a tremendous partner and friend throughout this organization's full life cycle. And you know, we all know AG Holder feels the same way. But I think to add to that, it's just maybe to tie the whole thing up in a bow. What we saw in California was a tremendous cry from the American people. It's such a juxtaposition from where Donald Trump, like you said in Texas, is dictating on high what a map will look like in a state in order to maximize his own preservation. You're seeing states like California where people are saying, we're not going to stand for that. And we're going to continue to do that across the country in order to fight back against what Donald Trump's doing. And that's the same thing we saw in Louisiana and Alabama after we got those wins, right? Those wins, first of all, they were hard fought and long fought by everybody on this call and then a billion other people, people on the ground, people everywhere. But what we saw was a tremendous outcry of voters in the primaries. Like new people were coming to the polls, and you can't unring that bell. Like once somebody goes to the polls for the first time in maybe their lives, maybe a decade, when they say, oh, maybe my voice is going to matter this time, my district actually looks like it's supposed to, you know, they're going to be involved in the democratic process. And that's what we're seeing in Alabama now. Alabama's a changed place because of the litigation we took. Louisiana's a changed place. And it will continue to change, and hopefully for the better.
That's absolutely right. The fact is that voting begets voting, and voter suppression begets voter suppression. And our job is always to work on the virtuous cycle while the other side works on the bad cycle. And one of the best ways to create voters is to give them a sense that, like you said, their vote matters, but also that someone's fighting for them. You know, the number of times that people come up to me, even in very red areas, and they just thank me for fighting for them because they just feel like nobody is out there like fighting for their voting rights. And And that's something, I think you're right. Like if you look at Alabama or you look at Louisiana, it's a state where I think a lot of those voters, black voters in particular, have good reason to just feel like nobody's been fighting for them. And the work that you all have done, the work that we've worked with you on, shows that people are willing to fight for them.
Yeah, I mean, just circling back to the results from last week, we saw, as you mentioned, incredible results in Georgia and Mississippi, right? Like this is, I think part of the celebration from the election is exactly what you're saying, which is that it's a mind shift, right? Like it's a mind frame shift. It's as much changing laws, changing representation, putting in place, obviously not to downplay the importance of the fact that these legislative bodies will now be more representative of what people want. But it's also this, in a place like Mississippi, this mindset that we can win and we can continue to win. And the powers that be in Washington, D.C. right now, desiring their control and power, no matter what anybody else says, is not going to be, it's not foregone. It's not a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump gets to decide what happens in this country, in every corner of the country, in every election. He will continue to try, as I know you've written about, Mark. Like this is not, we haven't turned suddenly a corner and, the White House and Trump are going to say like, oh, never mind. Like, we'll put the pens down on our attempt to cheat here. But it does give, fuel to folks who are tired. And they're tired of not having their voice heard, and they're tired of having to fight so hard to get their fair share, and all of those things. But that sort of energy and that fuel for folks to continue is so important. And so just being able to take the moment and reflect on that, while, as you've written, Mark, accepting and understanding and knowing that we have to keep pushing. I will take very quickly before I want you to respond, because I heard this sort of beautiful analogy over the weekend, which is that advocacy, like movements, are like choirs, right? Everybody sort of gets tired out, but you take a breath at different moments, and that's how the movement is allowed to keep pushing forward. And so, I know that people need to take their breaths, and we need to take our breaths. And so taking a moment to reflect on the wins, taking a moment to reflect on the wins of the election, is our quick breath before we get back to work with the fight that is ahead.
Yeah, look, I think there's one other good thing that has come from all of this. It's easy to focus on the bad that has come from the mid-cycle redistricting. It is easy to focus on all the terribleness that Donald Trump has unleashed in the Republican Party around these efforts in Texas and North Carolina and Missouri. And I don't minimize those. But the fact is that Republicans have had an advantage in certain areas. One, I'll give you an example unrelated to this, is for many, many years they focused a lot more on judges than we did. And I think that they had a 40-year plan about the federal judiciary when we didn't. And I think that when NDRC was started, it was started on the understanding that we needed to have not just a 2-year plan, but a 10-year plan. And actually a 10-year plan then became another 10-year plan. In other words, every year of the 10-year decade was a redistricting year in some form or another. In other words, it might be a litigation year, it might be a map drawing year, it might be a census year, it might be a preparation for census year, but that redistricting essentially happens. It might be a technology and infrastructure development year, right? But that redistricting essentially happens not in this sort of isolated space. And I think before NDRC, in fact, I know before NDRC, because I was doing redistricting before NDRC, that was something that I think the Republicans understood and Democrats didn't. And I think NDRC stepped into that and brought that rigor, but I think it was slow going in getting Democratic voters to understand that. Like in some sense, you all have been ahead of the curve for the last few years here, but it's been hard to get kind of the mindset around that on the left, the way there has been, I think, on the right. And I think that has changed. I mean, I think that everyone now gets and will get for the foreseeable future that when organizations like NDRC are telling them that this is a critical year, that this is a critical month, this is a critical cycle, whatever it is for redistricting, I think they will hear it differently. And I think that will pay dividends, not just in 2026 or 2028, but when we get to 2020, when we get to 2030 and 2032 and 2034, like, I do think there will be a different mindset that comes out of this era. And I think it is going to set us up for more success in the future.
All right. Thank you, Mark. It's always good to have you. It's nice to talk to you. It's nice to talk to you in a public forum as opposed to a private call, you know?
It's not that it's not that different.
It's not that different.
A little less swearing, but other than that, it's basically the same.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you. We really appreciate your insights and thoughts.
Can I just say that I hope Maryland redistricts?
You can. You can say that.
I don't know this guy Ferguson, I one way or the other, but I'm proud. It looks like the governor there is pushing hard, and that's good.
Yeah,
the governor has been extraordinarily strong, and I think will continue to be that strong. He's shown great forward-leaning and powerful pressure to really change and show the fight that we've been talking about this whole time.
Yeah. That's what we want. That's what the people want. That's what we learned.
I mean, that's what the people are asking for. That's what we've been talking about.
Right. And it's, I try not to go to the dark place all the time, but, and I know it sometimes can feel like we're saying everything is existential all the time, but like the 2026 midterms are so incredibly consequential to the future of our republic. And, I have a number of friends in California. So before Prop 50, we were reaching out saying like, hey, I'm a little conflicted. I'm a little confused. How should I obviously I want us to retain our democracy, but like, also, aren't we not for the gerrymandering? Like, what do I do here? And I feel like sometimes it feels so simplistic to just say like, do you like democracy? Do you want to keep your democracy? Because that is what we are fighting for. And I think Maryland is the next place where we need to show that we want our democracy. And at the end of the day, if the American people want a check on this reckless, out of control administration, we got to get it through winning the House. And that's the only thing. That's the most important thing.
I agree with you. I think this is going to be the most important midterms of our lifetime, and I'm confident that John will prevail on the Maryland legislature.
No pressure.
Thanks.
No pressure. This is so fun. I know, Mark, we could talk for hours and hours, but I'm sure we'll bring you back soon.
We'll pick this up afterwards.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, buddy.
Thanks.
If you like our show, please follow us on YouTube and Instagram at Dem Redistrict, or visit our website at democraticredistricting.com.
This show is produced by Reed Dudley, Sophia Pedroso, and Manuel Marce. Special thanks to Alex Yang. Editing and mixing by Play Pretend Media. This podcast is paid for by the National Democratic Redistricting Committee.